Good morning, Supreet. How you doing this morning?
Morning, Jim. Nice, top of the morning to you.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us on Jim Talk Moments. This is a platform where leaders can share their experiences and knowledge with new and growing leaders. And I'm your host, Jim Saliba. Supreet, we know each other for quite a number of years, but why don't I give you a few moments for you to tell us about ourselves, about yourself?
Oh. Well, we could talk about ourselves and we could talk about me. So,
Okay.
I think you know some of this, but the readers don't know. I have a checkered past, to say the least. Came into technology. I'm an industrial engineer, so operations research type process guy. Ended up in tech a long time ago. Been here in Silicon Valley since 1994 and meandered through a couple of tech revolutions, ups and downs, and CIO, CTO, and then was a partner at KPMG, was a venture partner a long time ago, and now then went into turnarounds and turned around a number of companies, got up to CEO. But I think the most important constant is that I've always been on the forefront of change. And now I'm founding partner of a Raiven Capital, which is a Canada Silicon Valley cross-border fund that is focused in tech, and
Hmm.
particularly the intersections, or rather where AI meets 5G meets IoT, and looking at complex supply chains and how we can help startups that take time out of the supply chain, take money out of the supply chain, create compression. But also, I think the more important thing is the customers always sort of here, and the companies here, and bringing them closer together so there's less dissonance in the system. You know, you're you're an expert at agile. We sort of think
Hmm.
of bringing agile to the venture community.
Wow, that's interesting. What sort of projects do you have going on right now?
All kinds of interesting projects, mobile money, new forms of e-commerce. You've heard the term headless e-commerce.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we've got a headless e-commerce investment. We've got a mobile money platform, and interesting enough, one's in Canada, one's out. It's global. It's in stealth mode. It'll be out soon. And of course, we every day we look at interesting platforms. We're very much like platforms, and so
Hmm.
and as when you have a supply chain view, that's sort of like you keep that God's eye view. You see the whole battlefield, so to speak, or the terrain, and then you can see where the bottlenecks are, and where they aren't. So, and between my partner and I and the team, we're big proponents of patterns and anti-patterns and how they work out. And of course, we had COVID, so the whole playbook got thrown out of the window.
Well, that's part of how people get very uncomfortable, and that's our topic for today. How did leaders get comfortable with being uncomfortable? And before we go into that, I just want to remind our viewers that are out there on YouTube, there is a chat window. I keep an eye on it. So if you have any questions for Supreet or I, feel free to type in there. So Supreet, what do you mean? When we talked about this, you kind of came up with this topic. What do you mean about getting comfortable with the uncomfortable?
Well, it's two ways. There's getting comfortable with the uncomfortable and getting uncomfortable with the uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
We're humans, we're creatures of habit. So we develop processes, and the processes evolve over time, you think, or they don't. Then what happens, we create a process. It worked for a certain situation at that point in time, and it was a solution, and then it evolves. And I'd like to give this example. This engineer guy, like me, is watching his wife make pot roast. And she puts it all together, dresses it, trusses it, all that. Then she cuts the ends off and puts it in the pot. And he asks her, "Why'd you do that?" Because he's a curious kind of fellow. or nosy, take your pick. And she's like, I don't know, my mom did it that way. Okay, end of conversation. Eastern comes around and he's at the mom's house and he's watching, and and they're making the same
Mhm.
pot roast again, signature dish, and again, they truss it up, fill it up nicely, and then they cut the ends off. They put it in the pot and stick it in the oven. And he asks him, "Why do you do that?" Our mom did it that way. Okay, so now you've reached generation one to minus one. You got to minus two, the grandmother level. Come Thanksgiving, they're at grandma's and all that.
Mhm.
And he's curious, he's watching this whole thing and is curious. A very interesting thing happens. She doesn't cut the ends off the roast. But
Okay.
he asked her, your daughter does this, your granddaughter does this, what gives? And she goes, we were poor. It was Depression era. We didn't have a pot big enough. And yet,
Yep.
what happens is we get very comfortable with developing processes and we don't change.
Mm.
The result of that is, and by the way, we deify it. When mom does it, how dare you challenge me? My mom, that's a momism. You don't mess with
Right.
momism, right?
Right. Right.
Nobody touches those. Those are religiously iconified in the family book. So you got to be really careful with, are you creating momisms? And I always challenge people. And of course, so we had COVID. We threw the book out. Everything shifted. The interesting part about it, we got very quickly very comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then we kept doing that.
Yes.
Look at
Yes.
us.
Yep.
Look at us. This would have been, hey, Supreet, come meet me. I'm going to get a group of people. We're going to be in a room. We'll sell
Mm.
some tickets. And, you're going to give some knowledge. We'll get other speakers too. And we'll create a panel or discussion or debate. Look at us. We're doing this over this digital medium called Zoom. We're enjoying ourselves. And what this has created, what COVID created was time compression. But I like to use a term that was used a long time ago that I read in a book by a guy at AT&T Labs. He called the death of distance. It used to be we had the telephone. First, the telegraph, shrunk it a little bit. Then we had the telephone. Then we got, faxes, etc. But now we have multi-dimensional depth of distance, and that you and I are
Yep.
actually sitting in each other's living rooms or offices, whatever, and having a dialogue and very comfortable. We think of it as very normal now.
Yes. It's interesting because when the whole COVID thing hit, the office I worked in said, "Okay, we're closing down for 3 weeks." And myself and coworkers were like, 3 weeks? How are we going to do this? How are we going to get things done? How are we going to work? Here we are a year later,
Right?
and it is just running like it did before. We figured it out. We made it happen. And I actually was talking to a leader in the medical area. They were making medical devices, and they were saying something along the lines of, we were looking to do this more remote working, and we had a 5-year plan to roll it out. Now we have to do it in 30 days,
Right.
right? So it's amazing what we can do and how adaptable we are as humans, that now it's kind of the norm.
Right.
So we're used to this change, um, and change and crisis happens, and leaders have to deal with it. And the first thing that many of them have are a lot of concerns and really downright fears, which stop them from moving forward. Have you seen that?
Yeah. So again, expectation management, right?
Mm-hmm.
An expectation that is made in a non-crisis time does not survive in a crisis time usually, because what happens is, we all have egos. You have ego, I have egos, and leaders are not as much thing as I think ego leaders might have even bigger egos that get bruised easier. And so in that, we create these dictums, the corporate dictum is
Mhm.
blah, 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 fill in the blanks. But what happens, you get a pattern of them. And I'm a big believer in, I call it wargaming. I learned it from my friends in the military, where, if you've been like I have, an IT executive, at some point you're always asked this question by the board: what happens if nothing works? What do we do now? Or what do we do then? And so this is that getting comfortable. Uncomfortable is the first step. Just first is awareness of understanding how to build that resilience. I like to use that word, resilience. And in order to do that, first is you actually have to create that scenario among your team. I was CEO of a very large company, people-wise, government contractor, and we had to keep things up. It turned out the head offices were outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, not very well connected. Connectivity was an issue and all that. And so I was like, we got down to what is the absolute basic functionality you need to have that you can
Mhm.
do without impacting the business? It might slow it down. The business
Right.
might be slow, but is it paper based? Is it technology based? What is it? How can we process things? And you know what? My team, IT team, business team, everybody's like, no, we just have to shut down. I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. Before we had computers, people still did business. So let's talk
Right.
about what's the process. So we got this big giant gas tank, and it powered a couple of generators. And then the generator, I said, we just need basic core functionality, right? So that we created a war room. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, okay, that desk is HR. That desk is accounts payable. This one is accounts receivable. This one's payroll. This one here is going to be, the audit function. Let's critical functions that we need to keep going.
Mhm.
Will is this laptop, and it mimics the system we had. And by the way, it's hooked up to a server in the back that's already a replication of your server AWS environment. So you can create this. And I said, okay, we'll be slow, but we need to process the orders we get. We need to process payroll for people. We need to process this stuff. And the first thing I got from people is, why are we spending all this money to build all this? We have disaster recovery. I said, where? Show me. So
Mhm.
it was what I call binderware. Really lofty plans placed very elegantly in a very nice binder on a shelf. And I said, where is it? And literally, I saw the guy pick up the binder. He was my CFO, pick up a binder, blew on it so the dust would, float away from it, opened it, and we both coughed when the dust got into the air. I said, how many years has it been since you opened this? He was like, honestly, I don't know. I said, let's update this. I said, I don't want a disaster recovery plan. I want a business continuity plan.
Ah.
And then I said, we're not going to do it this way. We're not making a plan. What do you mean? We're going to actually shut down everything and pretend it happened. Because it's the only way you can, those of us who have done
Mhm.
ERP systems, you and I have done these large implementations and all.
Yep.
The critical quality check was the conference room pilot. And I know I'm using people don't use those terms. They're like, okay, boomer, But here's the interesting thing: that conference room pilot mimicked the whole process in the conference room. That's what we created.
Right.
And I want us to mimic the whole process and then run it. For example, I got 17,000 people on payroll. I got to get that payroll out. How do we do that? Okay, I got all these, and these are all critical government functions because we were protecting the Pentagon and everywhere else. They don't believe in excuses. I said, let's go see how we can do this. Can we do this from a remote location? Can we get up multiple locations? So we ended up creating the biggest thing was shifting the mentality from it's binderware, we've got it somewhere, and we'll open it when we need it, to no, we've gamed it. We've
Mm.
done it like a war game. We've tested it, and all the, this, no, nothing survives first contact, as they say in the military. All the plans, the best laid plans of mice and men, all get thrown out of the window until you game it, and then All the extraneous processes that were people's comfort zones got thrown out. The processes that were made to placate people's egos were thrown out.
Right.
So
Right.
think of it this way: build a strategic plan that is operational, build an operational plan that has the raw basics, no fluff, game it. Why game it? Because then everyone on the team, it's sort of like a supply chain line making bread. So everybody knows. So the guy slicing the bread is not slicing the dough and then putting it in the oven. He's actually waiting for the bread to come out of the oven, because these are the kind of things, where it goes, where's the workflow, all of that. We can couch it in terms, but is what is the fastest point between when we started the process to the result, and the shortest one. And that's when what happens is a whole bunch of error gets worked out of the system. The other thing it did was, okay, what if the system shifted? What if you didn't have telecom? Then how do you process orders? Do we need, it starts asking the expectation question. Does this need to be in real time? What is the definition of just in time? What is good enough? So beyond what is good enough, the other piece of it was like, we would all these mice scurrying around doing all these processes, and I said, has anybody talked to the customer? Has anybody reset the expectation? Hey, we had catastrophic failure, we had a tornado, we had avalanche, we had snow, we had winter in Houston, when hell froze over. We can't work, we don't have electricity. What is that piece? And this is where you end up building resilience, when teams know how to adapt and adjust. Then how do you communicate? How do you reset expectation? That will really help you retain the customer. And more than retain the customer, it builds morale at a completely different level. The interesting piece is, after we gamified that and we did that, and by the way,
Mm-hmm.
this was like 4 years ago, we did this in real life every 6 months. The efficiency of the organization shifted, because people came and said, we don't need that junk in there, because if it worked in an emergency and it was good enough, we don't need to add those extra processes back in. Can we just keep this the skinny version? I was like, aha, now you get exactly what I need. See, people get married to processes and they own them because they develop them and all of that. And
Right.
then that
Right.
ownership creates that, tribal identity. I am keeper of super process, blah, blah, blah. And that's their raison d'etre. But when you take that out, it's like, it's the process, not the person. Then the collective wins. Then it's the team, not the individual. And that resilience is what tunes people to become comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable.
And then I said, get uncomfortable with the uncomfortable, because then you can game. I didn't know what I didn't know, but I ran through the exercise and this
Mm-hmm.
aha came out. And that's what we're looking for, is the aha. So first was, you got efficient. But then when you got uncomfortable with the uncomfortable, you started looking for how to become more effective.
I see. Something you said there caught me. You said you did this every 6 months?
Yeah, I went to the board, which was hard, and I said, we're going to shut down on a particular Friday. We did that on Fridays, less orders, etc. I
Right.
said, we're going to shut down and we're going to game this, and I need you to be with me. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, you're the board, you need to come watch this. And
Mm-hmm.
senior executives and all that, and the by the way, the board is usually
Mm-hmm.
the most skeptic of all things, and here they were like, it's going to fail. I was like, with one of them, he said he was the most vocal board member and he's going to fail. I said, okay, I'm going to put a C note down on a bet. And the guy's like, you're wrong. I said, okay, what are my odds? He said, what do you mean, what are my odds? I said, I want to give you, you give me some odds. And he gave me 3-1 odds, right?
Right. Right.
Because he thought we would fail enough and he would rake in 300 out of that C note. We won in the first 15 minutes. And
Hmm.
and that went to what we call, libation money for the team. But it was interesting because he had never done this. He had never taken his organization through an exercise. When you stress a system, any system, two things happen. The bad processes fall out, The players that are not engaged fall out or get retuned, right? And so people will self-select them out and say, this is too tough for me. I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to own it. And the people that own processes that fall out, naturally, they're going to diverge. They're going to converge towards, I don't want to be part of the process that fell out. Now I don't have a reason to exist in the organization. I need to be with the newer process. It's the funniest of things. The people that would be most resistant to change become the champions of change because of that.
Wow, that's really interesting. Being a process guy myself, um, I like this idea of stressing the system and letting things fall out where they don't need to be there. Um, from a software development process, which is my world, I
Right.
can see how much will fall out, things that we don't need. Um, and we do put a lot of stuff in these processes just so we can measure it.
Yeah, and I was, measuring it, quality controlling it. I always look at two components, which is what's the bare minimum you can document so a 6-year-old can understand how this works. Really
Hmm.
important. Secondly, is what in this resilience is repeatable so that you can take out of process A and apply it in process B in a completely different environment and it would still function.
Hmm.
When people start understanding, oh, I did this. I had a very interesting guy. He was my head of cyber, and he came back and he said, I just did this at home. I said, what do you mean? He said, we did an emerge because of tornadoes and all. We did an emergency. We battle tested our emergency escape plan, and we found that we had so many things. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we loaded up the car so much that if there was a flood, we would have been stuck in the gully.
Yeah.
And so the
Right.
question of go bag, the question of how do you a bug out bag, as it's known in the military. Sorry, I work too much with military. I use all these military terms. But what was interesting is when he brought it back into the team and he used that real life example, the team really got that aha moment in their head. So he took a process optimization we did at work. He went and made it a home optimization, and that resilient, he was able to teach his kids how to do this when they were reluctant before. Then now they were engaged because they saw value. And
Hmm.
then he brought that example back to work to showcase that this thing can work as a feedback loop full cycle.
Hmm.
And then when you get comfortable with the uncomfortable, here's what happens. You become very resilient. And so if someone throws a curveball at you, hell freezes over in Houston, Hurricane Harvey happens, fires in California, your ability to morph and be nimble, it creates agility. And leaders who are agile create companies that then can move like gazelles on warp speed.
Wow. So tell me more about your thoughts, the importance, we're getting to this, the importance of being resilient and agile, and not agile being software development, agile as in very flexible of an organization to respond to what's going on in the environment.
Yeah, one caveat, let me put that out.
Okay.
You cannot, in the audit function and the quality function, you have to follow the norms because they're the defining pillars of your operation. Because if you cut corners there, then you won't know how well you're doing because you just remove the quality impact piece. So that being said, the being agile, being nimble, so competitive landscape, you have a new competitor. They're a big gorilla. They got, they were created by an acquisition or a merger, and now all of a sudden, two
Hmm.
competitors who were your size, they merged and became the gorilla in the space. How do you become nimble to dance around them? This is the way I think. So, one of the things we know is that large organizations move slower and small organizations move faster. So, then you use speed as your advantage. You use customer touch as your advantage,
Hmm.
The, the piece I touched on, which was you can do all of this and be successful and not fail, but if you didn't change the expectation of your customer, hey, we have a crisis, we need your help. how do we work with you? And you
Right.
do it in the form of, if you work with us, we'll give you a discount. If you work with us, we'll rebate something. And what that does, it then they have skin in the game because there's an incentive. So I always believe incent good behavior and disincent bad behavior, and you use it across the processes you built. The other piece of this, in order to be nimble, you can't have silos inside companies. You really have to look at the handoffs. And one of my mentors is a guy named Elihu Goldratt who wrote The Goal, and he said failure happens in the handoffs.
Mm.
And if you can mitigate that failure, so you work on the toughest failure, then you work on the next toughest failure, and then you work on the toughest failure, you do two things. You align the organization and you remove the failure. When organizations start speaking the same lingo, which is alignment, they start running faster because then they start thinking in chunks. They start thinking in frameworks and models. Because once you have the crisis model and you can apply it across the board, all the extraneous stuff gets put out. And by the way, most organizations, in the number of ERP implementations I did, which were all successful, on time, on budget, here's the critical failure point: was people were trying to put processes in that had no reason to exist
Mm.
because they were
I'm going
legacy.
to hold you up 1 second there, Supreet. We only have about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
And I promised that I would get you out on time.
Yes, please.
So I'm going to ask you to wind it up and give us your final thoughts.
Okay. So the biggest piece of resilience, and the military does this, Outward Bound does this, team building organizations in nature do this because survivability is key, is the ability to change people's perspective on their safety. If people feel safer in the group taking chances and looking at the processes to fix them, to make them better,
Mm-hmm.
they will become faster and nimble. And that really is the difference. And the other piece it does is, if you then plant a goal in front of them that is a stretch goal, they'll always achieve it. Look at COVID. The stretch goal was, we need a vaccine. Look at us now, we're all getting vaccinated in a year. They took technology made for SARS, the mRNA stuff, and they applied and say, hey, this might work. But it's when we collectively get to that. See, this is the piece about being resilient: is you need a stretch goal, you need alignment, all the North Pole, South Pole gets lined up, and then you need to move out of the way. In Leo Iacocca's famous words, lead, follow, or get out of the way.
And away.
Yeah.
So from our conversation, I took notes. Some of the things that popped out to me was, one, you have to have awareness.
Yes.
Two, mimic it, but with no fluff. How do you make it happen in miniature? Three, gamify it, shorten it from end to end, and set expectations. Make sure you communicate. And I love that quote: failure happens in the handoffs. That's a great place to focus. I see that all the time. But you also said you can't cut corners on quality and audit. They still have to be there. Otherwise,
Yes.
your customers suffer.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the last thing I would tell you is, as a
Mhm.
leader, I believe in service leadership is serving. It's my job to clear the obstacles within the organization so my team can function better.
Right. That's very true. Can't forget that.
Right.
So I'm going to give you that as the last word, and we're going to close up for today. Jim Talk Moments. We would love to have you again. This was a great conversation, and I'll see you next time.